Hello everybody, welcome to the first marine restoration webinar hosted by Ocean and Coastal Futures. We'll be exploring the concept of seascape scale restoration. This is the first in a series of webinars that OCF will be hosting, generously supported by the Esme Fairbairn Foundation and the Environment Agency. Ocean and Coastal Futures is convening a change in the ocean sector, and through this series we want to create a space to learn about, discuss and debate the progress, needs and opportunities for marine restoration. We hope the lessons learned in these sessions can move things forward and help the sector progress. My name is David Tudor and I'm the chair today. We've got a brilliant panel who I'll introduce you to shortly. We've got Joanne Preston, Professor Joanne Preston, I should say, Marine Biology Professor from the University of Portsmouth, Sarah Young, Seascapes Programme Manager from WWF-UK, and Roger Proudfoot, who's the Estuary and Coast Manager for the Environment Agency. But before I welcome our guests on today, I just want to set the scene a little bit and talk about some definitions, or at least attempt some definitions, because our speakers will be talking about that and I don't want to steal their thunder in a second. So within marine coastal areas, ecosystems are highly interconnected, as many of you will know, and the pressures they face often originate far afield from many kilometres or many miles away. And this means an integrated approach to restoration is required, which can take a variety of forms, including marine planning, integrated coastal management, and source to sea watershed management. So seascape restoration has been proposed as one such approach for restoration, for habitat enhancement. And the term seascape is derived very much from landscape, although perhaps there's no formal definition, although we will hear from speakers talking about that in a second. But really at the heart of the seascape approaches is the recognition of, I guess, the life on Earth is supported by a myriad of different habitats and the connection between them. And that's referred to as ecological connectivity. And this is a core theme of the seascape approach and essential to planetary and human well-being. And we'll hear a lot more about that later on. As I've said, this term seascape is often used or often misused or often misunderstood, really. For example, in the offshore wind realm, seascape character is often talked about when it comes to changes in amenity from the view as a result of offshore wind development. The Blue Marine Foundation recently defined coastal seascapes as the physical mosaic of interacting habitats occupying the coastal marine environment across time and space. A further report a couple of years ago, back in 2022, from the United Nations Environment Programme, WCMC, their report said that a seascape essentially is based on a spatial area rather than any specific combination of habitat types, physical or administrative boundary and/or anthropogenic processes. And just to carry on, really, just to really frame what we're going to talk about today, we're talking about seascape restoration within the realm of marine restoration or marine habitat and species restoration. So as often with the term seascape, the term restoration is used in a slightly inconsistent way, although there have been perhaps more concrete definitions proposed. And here's one really from the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration, and it says, where it's applied, restoration is the process of halting or reversing degradation, resulting in improved ecosystem services and recovered biodiversity. Ecosystem restoration encompasses a wide continuum of practices depending on local conditions and societal choice. But marine restoration at scale is rare, and restoration seems to be distinct from conservation, often involving different communities of practice, different academic disciplines, different organisation, different teams within organisation, perhaps different advocates and different supporting policies. Another terms we use very often is regeneration and rewilding. And often there's a distinction between, and we'll hear about this later on, passive and active restoration, where one primarily uses human intervention to create or restore habitats and species, whereas the other is focused on area-based management tools such as MPAs, marine protected areas, to close or limit activity and therefore allow recovery or to restore. Our speakers today will hopefully help us explore these definitions a bit further. And just before I welcome them onto the screen, just a little bit of housekeeping. So you'll all be muted and your cameras are off, those of you delegates and people in the audience there. There is a chat function, so use this please to introduce yourself, to post links or make any comments or share resources. You'll also notice at the top of your screen there's a Q&A function right next to the chat. Now please use this to pose any questions you have to the panel. I'll be keeping an eye on this throughout the session, so this Q&A function can be anonymous or you can put your name in it. There are some versions of Teams you may have problems with using the Q&A, but please use the chat instead if you do have a problem with Q&A. But please, I'll be keeping an eye on the question and answer session. And if you like a question that somebody else has posed, then please do upvote it. So now I'm going to welcome our first speaker, our first panelist to the screen, Professor Joanne Preston. Joe, if you'd like to turn the camera on and say some words. Welcome, Joe.
Hi, David, and hello to everyone on the call. Thank you so much for asking me to speak today. What I want to do today is just share a couple of slides which summarises some of the thinking we've been doing as a community about defining seascape restoration and approach to scale up the recovery of coastal habitats. And so I'm going to start with the concept that I think everyone on this call understands, that nature is essential to human life. And this is represented really nicely by the Nature Scott wheel on the benefits to humans from the seas. All these ecosystem services that are provided to us by the marine environment. And these services are underpinned by ecological connectivity, which is the unimpeded movement of species and the flow of natural processes that sustain life on Earth. And it is these ecosystem services and functions upon which nature-based solutions depend to deliver our climate mitigation, remediate pollution, reverse biodiversity loss, and ensure the flow of ecosystem service benefits to people. Now, it seems obvious, but when you lose, and we have lost our coastal habitats, you lose the ecological connectivity and you lose the services it provides. And so seascape restoration at its concept is about rebuilding these connections and rebuilding the mosaic of habitats. And we've defined it as the restoration of multiple habitats concurrently or sequentially to restore functionality, resilience and connectivity across a mosaic of habitats in a marine ecosystem. And this wheel on the right is part of a paper that is just coming out, which really shows that spectrum of ecosystem restoration. And we use the term ecosystem restoration to align with the decade on ecosystem restoration. And it is a spectrum that goes from reduced impacts to remediation, through rehabilitation, to the final stage, which is often delivered by ecological restoration and rewilding, both fantastic approaches that will be differently applied in different situations to enable a recovering, reconnected, resilient and functioning ecosystems. Now, what I've been doing over the last little while is bringing the evidence to underpin these statements, bringing together the ecological foundations for this viewpoint. And as well as a paper, we summarise this in a report, which is shown on the picture here to the left. And a seascape approach to restoration is an evidence-based approach which understands coastal ecosystems are dynamic and heterogeneous mosaics of habitats, which are interconnected by water through which organisms, nutrients, matter and energy flow. And therefore, the spatial and historical context of a site will shape your restoration outcome of your project. And on top of that, to restore trophic webs and biodiversity to deliver the ecosystem services requires this existence of a healthy mosaic of coastal habitats maintained by the flows between them. And acknowledging this interconnected nature allows for more effective and holistic management, conservation and restoration strategies. So really a seascape approach to restoration enhances connectivity and restores these structure-function relationships, which is crucial for successful ecosystem restoration. And that might seem all very well and good, but where is the evidence? And as part of our work, we've been gathering together all the evidence for ecological connectivity across the temperate seascape and evidence for the delivery of ecosystem services. And then we went one step further to find the evidence where this connectivity demonstrates an uplift in ecosystem service delivery. And here are just a couple of examples here. For example, the light blue line is multiple habitats, increases coastal protection due to wave attenuation. Macroalgae drifting into seagrass increases the biodiversity associated with seagrass. The light pink line, the existence of multiple habitats, supports movement of species across their life history and enhances both biodiversity, increases nursery function and fisheries production. Salt marsh, the dark blue line, denitrification mediated by salt marsh can increase water clarity and primary production in neighbouring seagrass, so increases carbon sequestration and storage. The orange lines, benthic-pelagic coupling of oyster reef and increased water quality also increases primary production and carbon sequestration and storage in seagrass. The yellow line, movement of organic materials and sediment between habitats increases nitrogen and carbon storage. Salt marshes near seagrasses sequester more carbon and nutrients relative to salt marshes away. And the dark pink line, the presence of habitats increases sediment stabilisation, which has a huge impact on lots of habitats. So to summarise, a seascape approach to restoration reflects Rachel Carson's wisdom in nature nothing exists alone. And this conceptual diagram is just to underpin how a restored and connected seascape underpins the interrelationship between climate mitigation, biodiversity and human well-being. And we need to understand and recognise this interrelatedness if we are going to deliver our global goals represented by the SDGs, the biodiversity and climate frameworks. So hopefully this just gives you a flavour of some of the work we've been doing around seascape restoration, defining the seascape and defining this approach from an evidence-based place. And we'll continue this conversation at the Seascape Symposium in June this year, halfway through the decade. Thank you.
Thanks, Jo. That was excellent. Really great start to our webinar today. Really gives a basis for the further discussion, really. I'd like to invite our next panelist, our next speaker, Sarah Young, who is the Seascapes Programme Manager for WWF-UK. Sarah, over to you.
That was amazing. I have barely finished screen grabbing all those brilliant graphics and throwing them into OneNote. What a great way to frame the conversation we're about to have. Really appreciate it, Jo. Thank you, David, for having us. And good afternoon, everyone who's attending. I'm Sarah Young. I am currently sitting in Southsea in Portsmouth. I went out this morning and had a look at the sea. It's very grey and kind of chipper. It's cold at the moment, but I needed it for inspiration for talking about seascapes and why it actually matters to us that we're having this conversation in the first place. My personal background is in environmental economics, social psychology, and kind of conservation programs all around the sea. But I've worked for WWF for about 9 years now, long time. And as part of that, we've been doing work that speaks to seascapes or learning about seascapes ever since I started. So the first project I worked on was about the Marine Strategy Framework Directive and how that could be implemented, which is obviously large scale thinking about what a good and healthy ocean looks like. After that we were doing some work on the Marine Pioneer in North Devon, which is how you apply natural capital tools to look at seascape scale management, I'll call it. And then I was seconded to DEFRA for a year to work on the Marine Natural Capital Ecosystem Assessment Programme off the back of that, which is again a technique to implement seascape scale type interventions. The things they all have in common is they are all looking at how things are connected, the evidence base we're used to be making decisions, and trying to address what I'd say is one of the core issues with seascapes, which is how do you identify those trade-offs between decisions that we're making in relation to people or nature. So I'm going to give you a bit of a background to what WWF has been doing in this space over the last few years. I'm just starting my timer. Obviously, I'm going to have to knock off 2 minutes, David. Forgive me. But practical conservation-wise, restoration-wise, we started a while back now in Dale, where the ambition was to just show that you could restore coastal habitats. That was it. 2 hectares of seagrass meadow in Dale. And as that progressed, it was tricky. I'm sure there's a section on barriers and opportunities coming up, but that was tricky. The theory of change was that we would try and prove that it was possible, done. We would try and prove or show that it could be scaled up, which is some of the work we're doing in North Wales and Anglesey at the moment. We also knew that in order for things to scale to a seascape scale, then you needed to invest in mechanization. So a lot of the energy and capacity that we had to do restoration work in the first place came from volunteers, and that's not very sustainable in the long term. So looking at how can you mechanize the collection of seeds, the processing of seeds, and the planting of seeds to make it all a bit easier. We did some work in the Solent on trialing different approaches. So which are the best techniques in order to do this kind of work? And then we wanted to know whether it was possible to scale up, as in to community delivery, rather than somebody like WWF finding money and doing a project. Is it possible for that to be conducted, led, and in the future done by the communities that live there? So that was the foundation for the work we've been doing in the Firth of Forth. More recently, we've moved on to scaling to see if we can demonstrate that there are benefits to doing multiple habitat restoration in the same place. Are there synergistic benefits? Obviously, that's very intuitive to anyone who's an ecologist. Of course there is. But can we demonstrate that? And we're the very early stages of doing setting up a project in Norfolk to have a look at that specifically. So these things for us, the restoration and the seascape scale kind of ambitions have been building and building and building in small steps. And the culmination of that for WWF at the moment, and I should say, when I say WWF, I don't mean WWF on our own. There are hundreds of partners and other organisations we're working with to deliver all these projects. But the thing we're doing at the moment is working on something called Wholescapes, which is like Seascapes on steroids. It's how you connect the land, the river, the coast, and the sea, how you do large scale conservation. What are the barriers to that? How can we make it work effectively? And what do we need to do that? So I think it'll be really interesting to reflect through the conversation the similarities and differences, I suppose, between trying to do this across land and sea, and the way we're thinking about it in a purely marine environment, which is different and does come with different challenges. I think that's all I wanted to say as an introduction for now. There are so many wonderful projects and initiatives going on around Seascapes at the moment that this area is really exciting. I don't feel like it's a new idea. As Jo pointed out, we've had the Sustainable Development Goals, we've had Integrated Coastal Management, even the Wellbeing of Future Generation Act. All of these things encourage us to think in a more systematic way about how we manage and use the sea. But I think now is the time when we have more momentum and more capacity behind trying to do that in a way that's going to be effective. And for me, the only thing I would add to what Jo said in relation to definitions of seascapes is that layer of people and community on top and as part of a seascape. I think there's a lot to be said for understanding the ecology and the connection and the flow between habitats and species in the water. But I don't think it's very wise to separate that from us as people. And in fact, I suppose my definition of seascapes would be something around balancing the needs of the people who depend on the ocean without depleting it in a given place, which is what a seascape is. It's a place to do that, to trial, to test, to make mistakes, to try again.
Great.
That's...
Thank you, Sarah. That's excellent. There's loads of things in there you prompted me to think about, and I'm sure prompted people to ask questions about. So thank you for that. I'm going to move on now to get our third guest panelist onto the line, Roger Proudfoot, who's the Estuary and Coast Manager for the Environment Agency, and I'll just take the privilege as a chair to just answer one of the questions that's already appeared in the Q&A. Really, are we clarifying whether we're talking seascape means subtidal or if it covers intertidal? And without answering for all of the panelists, I'm certain here today we're talking about intertidal and subtidal, and indeed we're going to talk about further up the catchments as well. So yeah, just to clarify that one. But over to you, Roger.
Great, thanks, Dave, and yeah, really glad to be here. I'm Roger Proudfoot. I'm head of estuaries and coasts at the Environment Agency. And before I start, I'd just really echo the point Sarah made about partnership working and how important it is. And a lot of what we talk about, particularly in relation to things like the Rememory programme, that wouldn't be possible without a huge range of partners, many of whom I'm sure have joined the webinar today. And it's with huge gratitude that we've made the progress that we have today on restoration, and I'll say a bit more about that and how it's what I'd like to try and frame just in this few minutes is where my thinking is at and where we're progressing as an organisation with that partnership and how we're trying to look at that kind of more systematic approach. Really grateful to be here today, and that we've been able to sponsor the seminars along with Esme Fairbank, and it fulfills part of our ambition to make events more accessible to everyone, actually. And really grateful for Sarah and Joe sparing their time today to join the panel and the discussion that hopefully will ensue. So I was just trying to think about the question around large-scale seascape kind of restoration, and in my world, I look at it obviously from a national perspective, and I think there's a dual approach. Strong national policy leadership paired with that kind of locally empowered leadership and local action, and the success of both really depends on our understanding of the targeted ecosystems that we're trying to restore, improve, and the role in providing those kind of essential environmental services that Joe kind of was reflecting on. And I see that relationship as very symbiotic between the national and local efforts, and with local projects testing and informing the kind of national regulatory frameworks, while national policies and funding enable restoration, while protecting our natural heritage at the same time. And sometimes those two things, as we know, can cause some certain amount of conflict in terms of protection versus restoration, and that's an ongoing area of work for the Rememory initiative at the moment. So the next thing I just wanted to talk a little bit about was source to sea, and the view that that's critical to achieving the right conditions for restoration, for both active restoration and passive kind of more natural recovery from pressure removal. And that source to sea thinking recognises the critical flows of nutrients, sediments, materials, and biota through the system from source to sea, and it helps us to set out a planning framework for how stakeholders in a place can come together to consider how to remedy the disruptions in those flows to maximise the ecosystem benefits through the water environment from catchment to coast, and can act as a vehicle to get down to the nitty-gritty and get people together to kind of discuss those things. And it provides a focus for convening those local interests and encourages local leadership that can then be enabled with tools and information, and that really puts the power back to the people who are actually invested in that place. And source to sea doesn't mean we should hold off on practical restoration waiting for those perfect conditions to occur in our estuarine coastal waters, because we know that practical restoration can actually help alleviate pressures by absorbing nutrients and carbon. And often the habitats that we focus, like salt marsh, seagrass, oysters, etc., there is a degree of resilience in those habitats, which is evidenced by their presence. In some cases, even recovery in the current prevailing conditions. So, for example, in the Thames and the Tamar, we've got improving seagrass situations. So restoration projects can catalyse that local action, volunteers and local champions, which not only benefit the project itself, but raise awareness of the importance of these habitats more generally, which can empower people and encourage businesses to take wider restorative action that not only restores habitats through pressure removal and practical restoration, but it also raises the profile of protected habitats that exist, so that if they're aware, they'll care kind of adage. Next slide.
Oh, Roger, it's your own
I'm on the next slide. Sorry. Yeah. Right. Okay. So obviously supported in terms of restoration at that kind of Seascape scale, we need robust knowledge systems as well to support our work. And those are critical to creating forums and platforms for collaboration, shared learning, training, tools for monitoring, assessing and evaluating success and progress. And there are quite a few examples that are starting to develop now, like the restoration project platform, which the Crown Estate and EA are investing in, which was supported by DEFRA, and hoping to have a new version, a beta version of that ready for the Rememory conference in July. And the EA has got its own coastal hub now, which is starting to produce accessible information for the water environment. And the Coastal Partnership Network are developing a coastal hub, the one-stop shop where we can go for our coastal needs. And ecological and social science is obviously a key underpinning, as well as harnessing that kind of local community knowledge, sense of place, and any cultural heritage that can attract wider interest than environmental interests alone. And one of the key developments for the future in the Rememory programme, in the next 5-year plan that we've been developing with our partners, is to establish an estuarine and coastal restoration centre akin to the River Restoration Centre that's already established, to kind of harness and share that current knowledge and expertise that any one individual project struggles to replicate. But in having a kind of more critical mass of expertise, you can grow and spread that expertise and knowledge amongst all of the projects that we're wanting to do around the coast. So building capacity is something I just wanted to say a few words about in our social systems as well. At a local level, to focus on place-based solutions is absolutely key. Working in partnership with the people, businesses, government agencies and other interested stakeholders that have got a vested interest in that place. Recognising the power of local people. A good example of that is the 3 Cs programme that has been investing in local partnership development, which can then support the development of restoration project pipeline in a place. And that project pipeline to date, it's somewhat ad hoc and organic and piecemeal, though there have been some really impressive early signs of potential for practical habitat restoration and the early signs of groupings of projects that could potentially lead to real kind of seascape restoration, which we've got very few examples of, so the Solent being a good one. And there's a need to encourage that kind of join up at a seascape scale, joining lots of smaller projects together in an area to realise those greater benefits and absorb some of the risk, because not all projects will be successful. There'll be bumps along the way. And having a degree of freedom to learn by doing and adapting is key for any location. And restoration is for the long haul, with projects realising benefits 5 to 10 years from inception. So we need to be prepared to take time. Last slide. Sorry, it's me. In closing, if I was to summarise, effective seascape restoration requires system thinking that integrates ecological, social and conceptual frameworks in practical ways of doing at that kind of local level. And it creates an environment where communities, business and organisations can work together toward a more resilient coastal future. And I'll leave you an inspiring song recommendation to reinforce the people point. If you haven't heard it already from Patti Smith, people have the power. So have a listen and be inspired. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. That's great. Some music recommendations as well. I didn't expect that in this webinar, did you? So great. If I can ask Sarah and Joe to turn on their cameras as well, please. And if you can stop sharing your slides as well, Roger, that would be great. And then we can get into a little bit of discussion. There's loads of questions coming into in the Q&A. Please keep them coming. I'll try and get through as many of them as I possibly can. And just to say, we'll be gathering all the questions together. We'll be making the recording and the slides all available after the webinar, probably a week later by the time we've uploaded it onto the YouTube and website, etc. So just to get into a discussion, there's all really great from the three of you and really interesting. And I think you would just start to touch on something there, Roger, near the end, really around examples. So I just wanted to start us off really around, have you seen Seascape scale restoration being embraced and implemented here in the UK? Or perhaps, I guess another way of putting the question, are there any particular projects in the UK or globally that have led the charge on seascape restoration that are achieving particularly successful outcomes with this approach? I'll come to you first, Joe.
Hi, yeah, thank you. So, I mean, there are some really flagship seascape restoration programs happening at the moment. I didn't talk about it, but we're part of the Sonnet Seascape project. And the Endangered Landscapes and Seascapes program, which is a European-wide initiative, incredible funding, has just changed its name from Landscapes program to Landscapes and Seascapes program, and they're really championing seascape restoration at European scales. And looking further abroad, I work quite a lot with the TNC and partners in Australia, and they're really grabbing hold of this seascape approach, and not just seascape restoration for increasing the benefits from that, but they're really looking at it in terms of climate change projections and optimizing resilience for the future. And then obviously we've got various ones coming along the line that have recently been funded and popping up. And I do think that we've really got to embrace failure. We've got to embrace this is really pioneering. We're trying to go from pilot scale in different habitats to seascape. And I think the more transparent we are about what works and what doesn't work, and not to different approaches will work in different contexts, and embrace all those different approaches. I mean, ideally you'd take the pressures off and never have to do any active restoration. That would be wonderful. But yes, there's some really brilliant projects coming out, and I think we need to learn from other countries. So stay connected in Europe and other temperate locations.
Thanks, Joe. Coming to you, Sarah, you mentioned in your presentation earlier around, I think you mentioned Dale in Pembrokeshire, you mentioned some work WWF doing in North Wales, you also mentioned Firth of Forth, I think. So what have you learned, I guess, in those kind of stepping stones of progress? I mean, if they are stepping stones, if I can take them in that order, have you learned that how to be an exemplar, how it's difficult, how, as Joe said, how to scale? What have you learned along the way, really, to get to where you are?
I think I've learned that in order to get funding to do things, you need to say that you're going to be an exemplar and transformative and big. But actually, when it comes down to it, the little things are what you need to know. And Joe's exactly right about failing. These have not all been amazing successes. There's been a lot of learning along the way. I don't know if I can synthesize or summarize that right now. But I'd say one of the things that we've been able to do is to take like the core people or the core partners and through those different projects. So their experience, what they've learned, has been able to be dispersed among the newer people or the new project. And that practical experience of doing it has been invaluable to help things grow and build. I think if you start from scratch again and again, you're always relearning the wheel, and you're always spending a lot of time scoping and trying to work things out. For us, it's quite interesting because we're obviously a global organisation. Large scale conservation, seascape scale conservation has been going on for absolutely years, and it completely depends on the lens you're looking through. So, for example, over the last 4 years, we've been getting right back into Indigenous rights and cultural ways of doing things, traditional, practical ways of doing things, and how do they translate into the world we live in today? What can we learn from them, for example? We have something called a Coastal Communities Initiative, which is global. They've just released an amazing seascape strategy, which I should definitely share with everyone, because their model of scaling is beautiful and really relatable across lots of different kinds of cultures. Obviously, we find our connections to what's happening in Europe a lot more practically useful in terms of the legislation, and the approach is very similar compared to other places where it's a lot more, what's the word, like need-based, I suppose. But I suppose we just need to recognise this has been done for years, and there are loads of lessons we can learn from all over the place. The fact that what we would consider or define to be scale restoration in the UK doesn't seem to have many examples, doesn't mean that there isn't a lot to learn, and there aren't a lot of examples. I mean, even marine spatial planning, in a way, is seascape scale kind of management, right? The work that the Crown Estate's been proposing recently is seascape scale management. So I think it depends on your definition of what it is, but I like to be a broad church, and for us to think about all these different ways that we've tried to do it up until now.
Right, thanks, Sarah. I'll come to you, Roger. I suppose the same question, but also I think all of you touched on, oysters, seagrass, salt marsh. I mean, just for the audience benefit, really, have we historically been better at certain habitats than others, or are they the key seascape habitats in the UK now and in the future?
Yeah, just to answer the first question first, Dave. I think there are very few examples, as Sarah's already described, and Joe's given, mentioned the Solent, and I think if there was another handbook to be developed, it would be the how to seascape your projects, as it were, in any given location. And I think the map that I showed on one of the slides, we had 14 projects delivered this year with about £2 million worth of water environment improvement funding, and they're all a bit disparate, and they're quite small in terms of project size. They may form part of a wider partnership grouping of restorative activity, but there isn't that kind of coordinated at that kind of seascape scale all around the coast, which is obviously one of our ambitions, is to try and achieve that, because the more we can group those projects together, the more the ecosystem service benefits are investable. So if you just look at one bit of salt marsh or one bit of seagrass or an oyster bed, quite frankly, the ecosystem services you get from that small area don't really cut it when it comes to investment in. But if you can start to look at things on a seascape scale, where you've got a number of projects which are giving you that connectivity that Joe talked about as well, all of them together in the round can then add up to something quite significant for an area, and getting that kind of local investment from people, businesses, etc., bought into that, I think is really important. So what was your second question?
It was asking, we mentioned seagrass, salt marsh, and native oysters quite a lot. I mean, is that where it's been in the UK, and is that where it's always going to be? Are they the key seascape habitats for the UK, or have we got more to come, do you think?
Not necessarily. I think those are the ones that we've focused on because there is good examples of practical restoration being successful, both increasingly in the UK, but certainly abroad, and so we've tended to focus on those. And remember, it's obviously been that has been the three key habitats that we've been focusing on. But now we've we're not by any means at a point where we can say we've perfected the techniques. We've got a lot of experience in salt marsh, for example, through the flood risk side of the Environment Agency and others, and working with our partners, RSPB, WWT, Wildlife Trust, etc., in bringing some of those schemes to fruition, like Steert, Medmary, the Otter, and arguably some of those are at a seascape scale. They're quite big, but big restorative compensation schemes. that are do give a dramatic change to that seascape. So there are a few examples like that, and so there's a lot of experience to be gained from that, and that's why we want to try and capture that in things like databases and shared information hubs, fora, etc. So there's a lot more we can do, but I think it's that acting as a sentinel, if you like, for that wider seascape recovery. These are three really important habitats, but it's that kind of wider recovery that we want to try and ultimately aim for, and use those priority habitats as a catalyst for that recovery.
Jo, do you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, I think of course they're not the most important habitats, and actually we don't have any oyster reefs left at all, and so I think sometimes that priority around the native oyster restoration was recognizing what we've lost. And I think a lot of the work around seascape restoration is recognizing that we're working in an extremely degraded baseline. And we can see in the soft sediment habitats such as salt marsh and seagrass and oyster reefs, we've got really well documented losses, and we know the drivers of that losses, and now we really understand how much we've lost in terms of oyster reefs. But then there's all the rocky shore habitats, the deeper subtidal habitats, the quality of the mud, which is essential in interconnecting these. And I think it's really shifting the priority. Like, if you're trying to restore a single habitat, that is a really valid thing to do. But if you're trying to restore that without recognizing its seascape context, then you will almost definitely not succeed, because you're not seeing it as connected to the seascape around it. So that's when, we're not saying that we don't need single habitat restoration projects at all, or single habitat expertise, but I think we need to recognise they sit in the seascape. And one of the things I didn't, in the sort of short presentation, we did pull together all the evidence of the ecosystem services delivered across lots of different habitats, such as merle and kelp and mud and various other things. And we're still missing a lot of the data on these projects. And one of the data that we're really missing is around the cultural services they would provide. The reason why there's not on that diagram is because we don't have the evidence for it really in Europe and the UK. I think they do in America a little bit more. And so we need to do quite a lot of work when we're restoring, and any project that is going on is, as Roger said, we need to monitor the changes as they're happening. And it's only as we learn about the impacts of restoring single or multiple habitats and start to quantify these ecosystem services, then it will feed back into generating more funding for it. So it's the sort of really stepping back and having a wider lens when we're looking at planning. And seascape restoration should just be part of like climate smart marine spatial planning. It's a tool you can use. So I think there's some of my thoughts on that. I mean, oysters are cool, but they're not the only habitat.
Absolutely. I might stay with you, Jo, for the next question. Really, there's, and I should say this series of restoration webinars. There's going to be one on science, there's going to be one on policy, and obviously policy will come into regulation, that kind of thing. And we've got a couple as well coming on funding later on. But just to touch on some of those subjects, one of the questions in the Q&A, and something else that came up during your discussions, was around passive versus kind of active restoration. I guess really, and the question in the Q&A is around, are there restoration projects testing the removal of pressures from the seascape, allowing the environment to repair itself? So I just wondered if you could say a little bit around, I suppose, not exactly passive versus active, but a bit around the kind of difference, how they interact, and perhaps this question around removing pressures, because, as Sarah said, mentioned funders, funders obviously want big scale, they want things to happen, but often the issues preventing seascape restoration aren't at the site. So I wonder if you could comment on all of that, Jo.
Yeah, so one of the reasons why we sort of worked on that seascape ecosystem sort of restoration wheel spectrum is to really show that it really starts at the heart of reducing impacts, but that means you have to understand where the pressures lie. Before you even try and restore the structure and function, you need to see what's caused its decline and what's stopping it naturally recovering. And I think the Society for Ecological Restoration is moving away from active restoration versus passive restoration. I don't think it's a dichotomy we really need. I think you need to look at the system, see where the pressures are, see what the drivers of the habitat degradation and what is stopping them naturally recovering, and then plan your seascape restoration project accordingly. And wouldn't it be wonderful if that you could do a seascape restoration project by coming together with stakeholders, removing the pressures coming down to the water quality, and you wouldn't ever have to plant one seagrass seed or something else, because you've removed those pressures and enabled the habitats to restore themselves. That requires the scientific underpinning of the life history of all these different habitats, what determines their structure and function, and we're still learning those things. So I think there's a real big science knowledge gap to come alongside these, what will happen when we reduce these pressures. So I do think that I often have an ecological bent to my presentations, because I'm much better with like animals and people, but no restoration project will succeed without the community delivering it and the buy-in of the community. So for example, in the Solent Seascape project, we are doing some active restoration of habitats that are not going to recover on their own, but what we're really trying to do is find out what the situation is, the baseline is, with our state of nature report, and then we're bringing all the stakeholders together to try and develop a seascape recovery plan that will remove those pressures. So I think we've got to come at the angle, all these angles. So a long answer to that question, but that's my thoughts on it.
That was great. It's great, very detailed. Thank you. Roger, Sarah, have you got anything to add to that particular one, Sarah?
Yeah, I find the language of pressures tricky sometimes, because we do want to remove pressures so we can increase environmental quality, but those pressures are due to somebody benefiting from doing whatever that activity is. So it's somebody who is destroying something to benefit, or somebody who is like sewage companies using the ocean as a waste disposal system. Those pressures benefit people. They are beneficiaries, not just the actual private companies themselves, which is what we often assume, but also us. Like as consumers, the price of our water bills, for example, almost depends on water companies being able to release sewage into the sea so they don't have to deal with it. So I think in terms of removal of pressures, you kind of have to look at who is creating those pressures, what do they benefit from, how do they or others benefit from that pressure, and then who has the levers to change those use rights. So we can't tell the government to stop putting a load of sewage in the sea, or to tell companies not to put a load in the sea, but government does. And I think a lot of the use rights in the sea are determined by government regulation, policy, laws, bylaws, and all the rest of it. And as somebody who's done a lot of practical conservation in the UK, going about it bottom up is really strenuous. If you're trying to engage all those different stakeholders, change their opinions about what they need, open their eyes and inspire them that they could have a different kind of ocean that would support them in a different kind of way, that's a very long way around things. So for me, science can help us identify which of those pressures are the most important priority ones for us to help deal with or remove, and then it's communication, policy, advocacy that then help us remove the pressures, which is, to come back to the beginning of the conversation, more passive conservation than spending a lot of money on active restoration.
Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah, if that made any sense.
Did, yeah.
Can I add to that, Dave?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Sarah's spot on there. It's that combination of local knowledge and understanding of what's happening in your local environment versus what are the national levers that we need to influence to try and improve things. I mean, we've got examples. That's why I've started talking a lot about source to sea, because that connectivity with the catchment and what's happening in your sea environment is not always there, and there isn't an understanding of the impacts of, say, nitrogen coming down the system and impacting at the sea end of the water environment. And just by getting people to sit down and talk about those things. And look, it is the long haul, as Sarah's alluded to, but it's critically important, because then farmers, for example, in a catchment may have a change of heart in terms of coming together in clusters, for example, which is something that is happening in some catchments, to think about how do they reduce the amount of nitrogen that's going into the river that ultimately impacts on the estuary or the coastal water. And we've got example, but sometimes those drivers for that kind of change happen when an impact's already happened. And so we need to get into that space where we're encouraging innovation in farming or the water sector, so that they can continue to use the environment in a way that gives us all of the other benefits that Sarah spoke about, but actually takes account of the sensitivities through that system and the potential impacts on other users, say at the bottom end of the catchment, who are using the services from marine habitats for other purposes, fishing or recreation or whatever. So it's about getting that balance right, isn't it? And at the moment, I think that balance is not quite there, obviously, and we need to try and have those conversations. And I think where we can help nationally is by setting that framework, the policy framework within which those conversations can happen at that kind of more local level. So that kind of symbiotic relationship between the two, and the feedback loops that are created as a result.
Thanks, Roger. Coming back to that point around, we talked about the pressures and impacts, or the pressures rather, coming from outside of the restoration site, let's say. And you talked about source to sea, Roger, and you get summit to sea, and you get all these kind of various versions. I guess, is that the question to you, Sarah, really? Is that what WWF's kind of wholescape kind of concept is all about, really? Is it that kind of the whole catchment, the whole source, the whole intertidal, the whole offshore area?
Yeah. I mean, you can't fault us for being ambitious. It's Seascapes, but connecting the land and the coast and the sea, and fundamentally, so we've got 3 different pilot sites. We've got one in Norfolk, which is mainly a kind of food production based area. We've got one in the Firth of Forth, which is a potentially degraded industrial area, and we started with the kind of coastal habitat restoration there. And we have one in Pembrokeshire, which is a national park for a marine area, but also has issues with food provision. And the aim of the game is to try and tackle what we've called the triple challenge. So it's mitigating dangerous climate change, providing enough food for everyone, not depleting nature, and making sure we can feed a global population. So it's a kind of a small part of a natural capital. It's like taking out 3 important ecosystem services for people, and then trying to see how we can work out what decisions that are beneficial and positive to each of those issues are, and then where they intersect and cause problems for each other, and how can we balance the trade-offs between those 3 ambitions. So for me, Seascapes and Wholescapes are just a massive understanding, trying to understand the demands on the landscapes we have, trying to understand how those landscapes function, and therefore what our demands place on them, and then how we can get to a place where we're making decisions about trade-offs between different things we're going to do that are transparent, that are evidence-based, that have people involved in them, that we can back up and say, well, we've made this decision because of this reason, and we know it's going to have these implications, but that's okay with us because we're aware of what's going on. So it's more of I think Wholescapes and Seascapes, it's more of a change in governance, a change in perspective on the way we manage, the information we need to make those decisions, and how we communicate those decisions to others, than it is about anything else, really, because we're never going to have all the information or the data we need to make proper decisions, especially at sea. But what we can do is make the best decisions that we can with the information we've got, be adaptable, be transparent, and try and get people together to know where they're going towards a joint understanding of what they want their landscape or seascape to look like. These are all tricky things.
and so just building on that, Sarah, so we talked about kind of governance, etc. So one of the questions we have really is around what do you think are some of the main barriers to this whole scape delivery? And to give you two examples from the Q&A, is it different jurisdictions, different policy frameworks across that, land, sea interface and beyond? Or is it the funder and funder interest, or is it something else?
There are so many. We have got this historical social cultural system that's been built up over years that is designed around I'm going to sound really random now, but like power, accumulation of wealth, especially on the land ownership, and psychologically silos. We always say, oh, we shouldn't work in silos and we need to work across silos, but silos really help us, our little brains, to get things done and to put things into boxes. So none of this is bad. It's just we're working on top of a system that already exists. So yes, the challenges are like funneling strategic funding into where it's needed. It's the scale and the complexity of the thing we're trying to do. It's trying to work with people and understand people and engage with people in new ways so we can bring them together. It's the lack of evidence that we have to support the decisions that we need to make. It's one of the things I've been working on recently is how we actually work together. So the interdisciplinary nature, we need people with lots of different skills to be able to understand each other and work together to a joint solution. And so one of the things I've been working on is CDT Summer with Plymouth. It's like a multi-university PhD project trying to get PhD students to work on multiple disciplines at the same time, and even that within the education system is really hard. So there are challenges in all kinds of places, not ones we can't overcome. We have a desire to overcome them, but yes, lots of little barriers and big barriers.
Good. Great, thank you. There's lots there, isn't there? I just I think we're going to come back to that kind of people bit really and community elements of it. But there's a question in the Q&A I want to kind of pose really. I'll come to you, Roger, and then Joe on this really. And it's come from Australia as it happens. It says here we've lost vast amounts of habitat. It says without realising it. But the question is really it's a little bit around shifting baselines, but it's not only that really. I think the question is how do you go about determining what is most appropriate to restore at any particular seascape? In other words, how do you know what was there? How did it function? Where are we starting from? So how do you kind of, I guess, determine what to do and what to restore at what level?
Yeah, it makes me think about how the kind of Rememory initiative started really. And, that was about 6-7 years ago. And at that point in time, we were probably still quite focused on protective measures, and restoration was a fledgling kind of idea, if you like, of actually, do you know what? We've lost so much. We never mind protection. We need to start thinking about recovery. Well, recovery of what? And when I searched around for examples of recovery and restoration, it was the practical things that came up, like salt marsh. We'd been doing that since the late 90s. Yes, it was for compensatory habitat under the habitats regulations to compensate for coastal squeeze, but they were actually restoring areas that historically were salt marshes. And we've actually made some quite considerable gains. We've got 2.7% more salt marsh as a result of that, which is quite significant from a small country perspective, unlike Australia and its vast areas. And there was we knew that oysters used to be very widespread. I mean, Ruth Thurston's work recently with Feline and others and the NOR network, Joe, have demonstrated how prevalent oyster reefers were, vast areas of the seabed. And seagrass was present in a lot more of the waters than it currently is at present. So I think it was that 6-7 years ago is that knowledge base for some of the priority habitats that we know and love, that we were able to quantify more easily or had more understanding and research around. that kind of led to a kind of more of a drive around restoration. And now the question is starting to obviously broaden out now into Seascape and broadening into bringing more projects together into that Seascape scale. So I think it's been a natural progression of thinking for us as a nation to kind of try and go from that place of just focusing on protection and more into that restoration recovery. And I think it's particularly because of the fact we're facing climate change and all that brings, and needing greater coastal resilience, because if we're going to have more resilience of the coast, we've got to try and shift the baseline to restore some of these habitats that will give us some of that resilience. So flood protection from salt marsh, for example, or water quality for oysters, or et cetera, et cetera. So it's that realization that if we don't recover, we're going to lose even more of what we've lost. And so we need to, shift the dial and try and get there. And just on the regulatory and the tools that we've currently got in place. And Sarah's right, we've got a very complex picture, but we're not making best use of the existing legislation that we've got, either under marine strategy or water environment regulation or habitat regulations. If you look into those regulations, there are levers that can help us with our seascape restoration and recovery. And that's maybe something we'll come back to.
Thanks, Roger. Do you want to comment, Jo?
Yeah, very, very briefly. I think there's a couple of points. Historical ecology, working out what we've lost, doesn't mean we necessarily are going to go back to that extent. But what it does show us is how the habitat or ecosystem was formed before massive degradation. So it enables us to set ecologically valid ambitions about how the density or extent or the structure of the habitat. And that's what the amazing historical ecology work that Ruth Thurston Feline really brought to life. And so you need a proper knowledge of what the system looked like ecologically, its structure and function, so you can decide how you're going to restore it. And then different habitats will have different baselines that are appropriate. For coral reefs, we know, obviously we don't have coral reefs, but we know what a pristine coral looks like because it's within living memory. We know that of kelp and salt marsh, and to extent seagrass, we don't really know it for oysters. So different habitats will have different historical baselines that we want to sort of maybe aim to. We've got limited space in the marine environment, therefore we need to think about the feedback loops between these habitats. So that's when you need to decide not just the order of your restoration, like what do you want to restore first, which habitats are enabling environments, and what level of restoration will create tipping points. So how many oysters do you need to bring the turbidity down to increase the carbon sequestration and storage? And the final point is that on tipping points, the more we're restoring, the more we understand this. And I think a well-designed seascape restoration project that looks at the pressures and the order of restoration can enable tipping points. That means that active planting, putting down could be small, but have large effects in terms of extent, because it reaches those ecological tipping points when you get self-sustaining populations or natural expansion. So those were the thoughts I had in response to that.
Thanks, Jo. And that kind of ties together what we've been saying on this call already, doesn't it? Around removing pressures, active, including passive. It's not active versus passive. It's kind of including all of that. We've got a lot of questions in the Q&A. There's quite a lot around policy and regulation. As I said, in a future webinar, we're going to cover that in some detail. And there's lots of questions around funding. So I might touch on that in a second. But I want to come to this question around community and local structures and networks, really. I know you mentioned it, Sarah, a little bit in your presentation. So how do people and communities fit into this seascape approach is one question. And I suppose it's kind of supplementary question to that is kind of what local structures and networks does the panel think need to be in place to support seascape restoration? And the person in the Q&A has said they're thinking about partnerships and what can be done to set those up. So there's kind of two parts to that, the networks, and firstly, what role does community have in the seascape approach? I'll come to you, Sarah, first.
I think they are seascapes. They are the heart of a seascape approach. Oh, Jo, you mute? Yeah, cool. Thank you. So how do they fit? They are exactly what we're doing this for. They're the people who are going to be doing it. They will be the people that benefit or don't benefit from whatever choices we're making. I think they're absolutely essential. One interesting thing about seascapes as opposed to working on the land is that seascape communities can be quite spread, diverse. You might think if you're working in a city, you know the people in that city are the people that you're talking about and you need to interact with. When you're working at sea, it might be that you have offshore wind farms that are based in Denmark. You might have fishers that are coming from Belgium and Germany. You might have tourists, for example, that are part of your community using the coast that might only come there once a year or once a lifetime. So your definition of community and the people involved needs to be quite flexible, I suppose, to incorporate the fact that the sea is used by lots of different people who don't, well, none of them live in it. In terms of structures to support, for us, it's been, I think, always having people who come from a community, who are embedded in the community and who know people in that community is a great starting point for any restoration project or any kind of seascapes initiative. You need people who've got a history, who know the culture of that place, who know the people that live there. There are networks, the what's it called? Coastal
Partnership.
Coastal Partnerships
Partnerships.
Network. Yeah, they've been around for donkey's years in the UK, and they are absolute gold dust when it comes to delivering projects and knowing what's going on and knowing who might need to be involved. On the land side, the catchment-based partnerships as well, CABA, have been around for a long time. There's a wealth of experience that you can draw on in the first place, and so us, for when we're going into an area, the first thing we do is a ton of scoping in terms of what projects have been happening in the past, what projects and initiatives are happening now, what is the local social capital, who are in those networks, who are doing stuff. For Norfolk we did, or for the UK we did a huge project on social justice and equity. So what's the kind of the history of equity in these places, so that we're not coming in saying things that are tone deaf to the the different experiences of the people that have lived there. So in terms of structures to support, I think they're there. You need to find them. In terms of how people fit into seascapes, they are seascapes for me, and so they fit. They are. That's it.
Right. Thank you. Thanks. I'll come to you, Roger, for that. But I also want to. There's so many questions here. I also want to ask you something else. If you think about that community bit, but also there's a question here which is relevant for you as a government agency. It says, how do we balance the need to embrace the complexity of the whole system? So we talked a lot about the complexity and interactions here, and then the land sea interactions as well, and the interconnectedness of all of that. That real kind of scale as well as what we want to do. How do you balance that with the need or the perceived need for quick, practical action on the ground to enable you to show measurable outcomes, or to show measurable outcomes to government and funders?
Yeah, that's that's a really a difficult question, because we know that, I mean, the Otter example for the restoration that's happened there in terms of returning the estuary back to its more natural form to a large degree. That was 15 years in the making, from an idea from one person, who then actually was continuous throughout that restoration program, and it was done for compensatory habitat. It was driven. One of the main drivers was that, because we were potentially losing habitat elsewhere. So that quick practical action, I don't think is we need to get away from thinking there's a quick fix here, because these projects take time to scope, to get support for, to evidence, and to attract that investment and funding. But what we do need is continued government support to seed that scoping and that development, so that we can pipeline more projects. I mean, I gave the example of the number. Look at what's out there. There's 72 projects in our pipeline that's come about in 2 years, and that's lots of partners. There's so many partners involved in all those individual projects that's coming to the fore. So there's a real appetite for doing more projects, and I think we are on the tipping point of funding. There is more positivity around potential nature recovery funds, and we need to take those opportunities that come about and make sure that the estuary coast bit doesn't get forgotten about in our quest to improve our rivers. That's important, as we've already said. Source to sea is really important, but don't forget 37% of our wastewater goes directly into estuaries and coasts. So I think that complexity it shouldn't act as a barrier in this land sea interface, because ocean blindness is another barrier. Those local communities are not are more deprived than inland, and they need equitable access to improving their local environment. Just because you can't see it doesn't mean that they don't benefit significantly from its enhancement and improvement. And so that needs to be an ongoing focus. And in terms of involving community, sharing information, simplifying the science, time and time again I see scientific presentations that bamboozle people and they don't really understand. They want the summary, and an AI, I think, has got a role that it can help you summarize in simpler ways that people can grasp more quickly. And we need to share that information, and Sarah's already mentioned the CPN work, and hopefully there's some good news coming on that, because there's going to be a coastal hub that is going to, that Amy Pry and others have been working on to kind of be that one-stop shop to share information and knowledge, those simpler bits of information that people can then use locally to bring people together to talk about, get them talking about source to sea, get them talking about what can they do locally to improve their local environment. So there's lots in the pipeline. I have to say one thing though, all of that funding is potentially under threat, and so we're in a difficult funding kind of climate at the moment, as I'm sure you all appreciate, with current drive to improve things as a nation as a whole.
Thanks, Roger. I might just come for you to comment, Joe, on this kind of complexity versus kind of the need for, or perceived need for, quick wins from funders. You're obviously involved in multiple projects over many years, and being a scientist, you understand that complexity, but equally, people want to see results, whether that's funders or regulators, whatever it is. Yeah,
I think that we have to have frank conversations. Like when someone wants to build a offshore wind farm, they don't expect it to happen to 18 months or 3 years. These large projects in marine environments that we're really socially used to doing involve lots of money and lots of time and lots of technology. And I think we need to really start making that sort of social cultural shift to understanding that to restore coastal habitats and do source to sea requires multiple partners, multiple years, and quite large pots of funding. So I think we do need to recognise the reality of the delivery. And I think once you have those conversations with funders, then you can start putting in milestones. So, and say, to achieve this, we think it will take 20 years. But the first step in the first 2 years, we'll understand the baselines and existing connectivity. Then when the next year, we'll start putting in some of the achievable restoration and work with stakeholders, remove pressures. Then as we monitor, we can do some adaptive management and see where the recovery is happening. So I think that it's a balance between, yes, we want to be ambitious and we should be ambitious, but we need to make that in a sort of a grown-up conversation about the reality of how you deliver that and making appropriate milestones, because otherwise it puts, I think, undue pressures on quite small restoration communities and projects to deliver what would be unrealistic. The other thing is, it's also not rocket science. And so I think it's being realistic about, okay, we need hatcheries for oysters and for seagrasses. We need to be able to grow the salt marsh. We need the technical skills to do these things. We need people who can use the AI and measure the biodiversity and the eDNA and everything else and say, what do we need to deliver this? And then funders can choose which element they want to fund that aligns with them, as well as we gather the evidence on the ecosystem services delivered by these, and funders then can pick the ecosystem service that they're most interested in. So I think it's having that open and honest conversation about what are the skills and equipment and time and investment we need to achieve that. And so funders can match their interests with the different stages of the programme. I also think that that relates to this, something someone else mentioned about our relationship with nature. You know, so far humans have had a mostly dominating relationship with nature. And the main purpose is to utilise nature for our own purposes. And that's got to a point when it's no longer working. And so I think that that requires that shift, that it's not automatically our right to extract anything for nature for our existence. And I think that is a shift that needs to be based on the evidence that if we carry on doing that, our existence will also be imperiled. And I think that's what the cultural shift we're getting to towards now, in terms of the circular economies, sustainable planetary boundaries, and that's where we need to start to innovate within these spaces of sustainable planetary boundaries and circular economies and growth. So I think, you know, it's not unrelated to all these sort of social political ideas either. So that all links into some of the comments about the way that we manage resources in the marine environment and not recognising the costs of our actions.
Yeah, thanks, Jill. That's tied a lot of things together there. And I think going back to that earlier point you made around, I guess, relative short-termism, you know, these initiatives may have funding for 5 years, but they're really 20, 25, 50-year initiatives, really, aren't they? And I've heard some people say we should stop calling them projects and just say we need to restore this seascape or landscape and we'll get funding along the way, rather than looking at it as short-term projects. We're coming to our close in the next 10 minutes, and I just want to touch a little bit on kind of strategy and funding and on that kind of question. So there's a question here, really, there's two questions here in the Q&A around seascape restoration takes a long time, over long time scales, large spatial scale. So how do we ensure that projects and resources align so they're used effectively? And another question, which is, I'll ask it as well, it's the same sort of question really, is about the ad hoc nature of projects coming through. You know, do we accept that as you mentioned, Roger, you've had 20, 30, whatever it is, projects. Joe's been involved in loads, so has Sarah. And do we just accept the ad hoc, haphazard nature of these projects coming through? Or do we need to kind of double down on the strategy and the planning to have some sort of control to really achieve the ecosystem function that we need under the Seascape projects? So easy question, that one, Roger. I'll come to you first and then I'll come to the others.
Yeah, I'll preface it with subject to funding, Dave. You know, we can achieve an awful lot more to, you know, certainly one of the ambitions of Rememory was our next stage would be to look at potentially how we can group some of those projects. We've also got the restoration priority maps, which have been poured over by a whole range of organisations to arrive at places where we think that are doable in the next 5 to 10 years. And so those priority maps are really helpful to help coordinate our thinking around, well, how can we support local partnerships to bring that together into a kind of more seascape project? And I see that as potentially the next phase for Rememory, is to, from a national perspective, how can we support and enable that, you know, by providing that information, by helping to support local, you know, the Champion Coastal Coordination. The limited funding that we had was key to some partnerships employing somebody to be able to then bring those partners together, to then bring that pipeline of projects to the table. And that's absolutely critical. And I've put it in the comments that, you know, we haven't had anybody else step up to the plate yet in terms of co-funding that kind of really important. It doesn't necessarily give you outcomes, which is why people tend not to want to invest in it. You know, it's not something you can pin your flag and say, we've restored that bit of habitat. It's people scoping out, working with partners. It's less tangible, but nonetheless super important to fund, because that without that stage, you don't get to the practical stage. You don't get people bought into what you're trying to achieve. So I think that's partly where we need to go next. And obviously, if we're through the spending review, if we get certain amounts of funding in various pots, then we may be able to progress some of that further. But we're always open to partners, co-funders, etc., to come on the journey with us.
Thanks, Roger. Sarah, do you have anything to add on the ad hoc versus the strategic planning?
Yeah, it's one of the big challenges, the fundamentals we're trying to address with our Wholescape work, especially in terms of funding. We know from working on the Marine Pioneer that actually, in order to get investment, especially private investment, it needs to be at a certain scale. There people just aren't interested in investing in tiny things. So we are all kind of testing if a Wholescape scale is an appropriate way to pull money in, both like in terms of blended finance, public and private finance. And to those ends, we are exploring something called a contribution model, which would be where if you are getting money from biodiversity credits or money from carbon credits, or if there's money people need to put in for compensation, or there's interest in corporate investment in a place, it can go into one pot that is then distributed according to that area's priorities. So therefore, it isn't like I'm an offshore wind company, I'm going to fund this, or I'm a farming company and I'm going to fund this. It's a lot more aligned with the county or aligned with whoever it is that it needs to align with to be at that scale, which is really exciting. It's worked in other places. We're excited about that. I think what Roger is saying is absolutely right. In order to be strategic rather than ad hoc, you need to be coordinated, and that facilitation, the convening role, absolutely is something that we need to love, cherish, support into the future in the places that we're working. Yes, like ad hoc there's nothing wrong with ad hoc. Ad hoc when there's an opportunity and you've got some money and you can do something good is brilliant. Ad hoc as part of a wider plan is exactly what Seascape should be all about.
Great, thanks, Sarah. As I said earlier on, there's lots of questions here around funding. You touched on biodiversity net gain. There's obviously strategic compensation, the Marine Recovery Fund coming along in England and in England and Wales for offshore wind. So there's going to be a lot of discussion, I think, in future webinars about this. And there's a question in the Q&A around how do you coordinate the input of industry really on this. So we can come back to those. But I just want to finish with a very quick question, or quick answer, I should say, really, for all three of you. So what's your hope, or maybe I should ask, where do you believe we'll be? Where do you believe we'll be in 10 years' time on seascape restoration? Maybe it's a blend of hope and weird belief. I'll start with you, Jo, just briefly, each of you, please.
What I hope to be a part of is transforming society's understanding of what is possible in terms of restoration. So just moving the baseline about what our societal ambitions should be, what we should tolerate, and what is achievable. And I think that will come through the lessons that are learned, communicated over and over again. So I am hopeful, but it does need communities coming together and to deliver it and be bold and ambitious. And I think we're getting to that point. So I think we're going to see a huge step change in what we think is feasible in the marine environment in terms of habitat restoration.
Thanks, Jo. Sarah, very briefly.
To be fair, I completely agree with Jo. It's like all about redefining what is possible, demonstrating that it is possible, and it's a good thing to do. And then behind that, all the kind of capacity and the motivation and people aligning from government to communities to NGOs to all the scientists, all the rest of it, aligning behind that because we want a better future and we can see how we can achieve it. So I don't know if that's 10 years, but yes.
Yeah, that's great. No, thank you. And Roger, finally.
Yeah, I think for me, it's about it would look like a professionalized kind of restoration at a kind of seascape scale. So we've got people trained and capable all around the coast doing this kind of work not in a piecemeal fashion, but is actually ongoing. It's an ongoing commitment by all of the both national and local, and essentially a kind of Solent type exam, everywhere, all around the coast would be where I would hope we would be in 5 to 10 years time, and we're on that journey of recovery.
Excellent. Wonderful. Great way to end. Thank you for that, Roger. Well, that brings us to a close. I'd just like to thank our 3 excellent panelists here today. Joanne Preston, Professor of Marine Biology at University of Portsmouth, Sarah Young, Seascapes Programme Manager for WWF, and Roger Proudfoot, the Estuary and Coast Manager for the Environment Agency. As I said right at the top of this webinar, the recording will be on the OCF website and on YouTube channel soon, and also the slides, and we'll gather all the Q&A as well. Look out for the next in the Marine Restoration series coming soon. Thank you all for watching, and goodbye.